The next question is, do you believe the tongues that are spoken today in churches, such as Pentecostal or Charismatic churches, are the same tongues that were spoken by the apostles and very first Christians that were around? And in Charismatic and Pentecostal churches, the congregation openly speaks tongues. Do you believe that this is wrong if 1 Corinthians 14 verses 27 through 28 clearly states that we should not do this?
Before getting into the specifics of this video, have you ever noticed that people seem to always ask this type of question about the legitimacy of tongues today, but nobody ever really questions things like, say, the fruit of the Spirit? Think about it. How come you don't ever hear, is what we see today in churches the same fruit of the Spirit talked about in Scripture? Instead, it always seems like it's the supernatural aspects of Christianity that gets put under the microscope and called into question. I mean, it's not as though fake or counterfeit experiences are confined to this category.
If the question is, the tongues spoken today in Pentecostal churches, are those the same that were spoken in Acts? I think it's easy to say that they're not. I mean, it seems obvious that they're not.
I'd be curious to know why he thinks it's obvious they're not the same tongues.
I don't know anyone that speaks in tongues that speaks the language they didn't know, and that there's people around that are hearing about the glory of God from it.
Okay, maybe this is the reason he thinks it's obvious. But this is anecdotal. Anecdotal arguments rely on personal experiences to arrive at broad conclusions. And the issue with that in this case is there are countless people in Pentecostal and Charismatic camps who will tell you they or someone they know have spoken in a language they didn't know. In fact, I've found that whenever the topic comes up, there's usually multiple people who will testify to the same. Here are some comments from this very video. So he hasn't had the experience yet. Nothing wrong with that. Maybe someday he will. Now, someone might say, I don't believe these testimonies. Okay, don't believe them. People are free to believe or reject any testimony, but it's not as though you can provide any kind of proof that they're false. At least not all of them. It would just be your opinion. Have at it.
People have like a prayer language or something. I mean, this would be a more difficult question if someone said something like that. But if the question is, are the tongues spoken today the same as those spoken at Pentecost? No.
That wasn't the question. The question was whether or not the tongues spoken today by Charismatics and Pentecostals are the same as those spoken by the apostles and first Christians. And you wouldn't be able to answer this question from a scriptural perspective. Why? Well, you may not have known this, but Acts 2 isn't the only record of Christians speaking in tongues in the Bible. There are others, and in these other instances, we are not told whether or not anyone present understood. Same goes for when the Apostle Paul spoke in tongues. The scriptures do not tell us if there was always, or even once, an interpretation. Arguably, tongues without interpretation was such a common occurrence back then that Paul made it a central issue when he wrote to the Corinthians. Also, let's not forget about 1 Corinthians 14:2, which speaks of tongues which are not spoken unto men, but unto God, a mystery that nobody understands.
You know, when we talk about like the Orthodox prayer bypassing the brain and going to the heart, this kind of tongues thing bypasses the brain, but not in a good way.
This is a common claim that tongues spoken without a public interpreter is not a good thing. The Bible never says it isn't a good thing or that it's a bad thing. In fact, it kind of says the opposite. The person who gives thanks in tongues without an interpretation, Paul says, is doing it well.
You know, it's like there's no understanding. And it does seem like scripture talks about that you shouldn't give a word without understanding. So it has to be interpreted.
The Bible doesn't say tongues have to be interpreted. It says if there is no interpreter, yes, you should keep silence. But it says in the church. It doesn't say keep silent in your own prayer time. And by the way, keeping silence doesn't mean you can't do it at all. In fact, the verse continues on and actually instructs the person to continue to speak, but to themselves and to God.
St. Paul, in the list of spiritual gifts, tongues is on the bottom. Tongues is not at the top.
I'm not sure all tongues should be considered a gift. In fact, 1 Corinthians 14, when Paul discusses the prayer tongue, he never explicitly refers to it as a gift. Instead, he calls it praying with the Spirit, or praying in the Spirit. I think sometimes we are too quick to attribute anything supernatural to being a gift, and thereby dismiss any responsibility by claiming we don't have it. Imagine if someone said to you, I wish I could teach my children about the Lord, But teaching just isn't my gift. After all, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12:29, are all teachers? Well, the obvious response to that is you shouldn't be categorizing all teaching under the heading of a gift. There's a practical type of teaching which we all should use, and then there is a gift that should be used in a specific type of ministry that one is called to. What if there is the prayer tongue that we should all use, and then there is a specific kind of tongues to be used in ministry with interpretation? I'm not insisting this is the case. I'm merely suggesting that maybe we pause and think a little deeper about this topic instead of just assuming that all speaking in tongues is a gift. We go into greater detail regarding this in our FAQ on the topic.
The Spirit can come on people and do whatever the Spirit wants, but usually these things aren't being led by the Spirit and Spirit-born. They're something else.
Okay, if you said that some of it may not be of the Spirit, or some of it may be fake or of the devil, okay, sure, that's reasonable. But to make such a blanket statement as it's usually not of the Spirit, I have no idea how any human on the planet could come into possession of such knowledge. Can one even be aware of all the speaking in tongues going on right now around the world, let alone the nature of such tongues? There's the logical fallacy known as amazing familiarity, where the information being put forth seems impossible to have obtained without access to omniscience. Maybe this guy just meant that the cases he knows of, it usually isn't that, but obviously that doesn't speak for everybody else. Thanks for watching, and remember, these videos are not meant as any kind of attack on the people featured, simply for instructional and dialogue purposes. I always encourage my audience to go to the source whenever I do a response video like this. I'll link to it below, and you can let me know if I took anything out of context. And of course, the gentleman in the video or anyone from this channel is free to reach out and issue a response or clarification. Let's keep things civil and in a spirit of humility. Till next time, see ya.